Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com. This is Triangulation, episode 126, recorded October 30th, 2013. Tom Standage and social media the first 2,000 years. Triangulation is brought to you by Lynda Com. Learn what you want when you want with access to over 2,000 high-quality online courses and training videos, all for one low monthly price. To try it free for 7 days, visit lynda.com/triangulation. That's LYNDA.com/triangulation. And by Personal Capital. With Personal Capital, you'll finally have all your financial life in one place and get a clear view of everything you own. Best of all, it's free. To sign up, go to personalcapital.com/triangulation. It's time for Triangulation, the show where we get interesting, smart people on and talk about technology and what's going on. And we've got a really fun one today on Triangulation. I first became aware of Tom Standage, I think 15 years ago, he tells me, when he wrote a book called The Victorian Internet, which was really a great piece, a history of the telegraph and how in many ways it duplicated the internet. He's back. He's written a number of books since then, but he's back with his newest, which is called Writing in...
No, it's on.
That looks like... Oh!
Yeah, I know. They changed it. It's on.
Oh, you know,
it's the story of my life. We're having this thing reprinted.
My first question was, why did you call it Writing in the Wall? I thought it was some clever...
Okay,
that is an O. I could see it's an O now, but unfortunately...
Well, the British cover is much better. It actually looks like an O, so we're going to switch back to that one.
Good. Always
what
better. Tom, welcome. It's great to have you. I should give you the subtitle of this book, Social Media, the First 2,000 Years. And it really is a great read. Tom, it's so nice to have you. Before we talk about the book, you've written for many magazines, including The Guardian. And just yesterday, David Cameron called for the censorship of The Guardian over its revelations, Glenn Rewald's revelations of the Edward Snowden slides. Is the press not protect? In the U.S., the protection would be, well, it's a First Amendment right, the right of the press it's the Fourth Estate to print whatever it wants. Is that not protection? Not in the UK?
No, it's not. So and this is actually one of the stories I tell in the book. What happened was we used to have statutory regulation of the press, and it used to be the case that you had to get permission to print things. And during the English Civil War, the regulation of the press broke down, and there was an explosion of pamphleteering. And as a result of that, everyone got to say what they wanted to say, and some people thought this was terrible because no historian would ever be able to write a decent history of the war because they wouldn't know which was true and which was false, and this sort of thing. So you get all these very modern debates, and other people said that the big problem with this sort of access to the press was that you got people casting. That's right. They basically say that mud sort of sticks to people's faces, metaphorical mud, and it can never be washed off. So it's the same complaints we have about Twitter today, that that you can say something about someone on Twitter and badmouth them, and the rumor is very, very hard for them to rebut, and you can't withdraw tweets and all this sort of thing. So what ended up happening at the end of the 1600s is that there were various attempts to re-regulate the press. And they all failed. And so by default, there was then no regulation of the press. And we have some pretty silly libel laws in this country, which in practice are the biggest restraint. But we don't have formal, and we also have, hate speech laws and things like that. But we don't have formal regulation of the press. But we don't have a constitutional right to free speech either. And what's been happening in the past couple of years because of the phone hacking scandal and so on is that politicians have been saying, we need to do something about this. We need to regulate the press to stop this kind of thing happening again. They're stepping out of line. The self-regulation process doesn't work. And so what we're seeing a lot of at the moment is politicians saying, look, this is a reason why we need press regulation and so on. So we don't have a a First Amendment right. In fact, if anything, we're going in the opposite direction, and politicians are trying to impose limits on the press. And of course, this is brilliant if you're the Chinese, because you can say things like, well, this control of the internet and control of the media. Well, I know you think it's a bit funny, but it's just what Britain's doing. So, we're just
Not good.
So this is a gift to them.
Yeah.
And it really isn't good. But it's also, people in tech know that politicians are always saying, oh, well, we need to pass a law that makes this bad thing to do with the internet go away. And anyone who knows anything about technology just sort of laughs and goes, that isn't going to work. And it never does. And either the law dies or it passes, is ineffective, and then is quietly killed. So the French tried this, where they had their law against file sharing. And they had 3 strikes and you're out. If you share stuff, we'll cut off your broadband. And and they had grannies being cut off because people were stealing Wi-Fi, or they couldn't prove that. There were all the things that you can imagine that would go wrong went wrong, and the law got killed. So unfortunately, this is of a piece with that, which is this is sort of a thing that a politician thinks he looks good if he says, and anyone who knows anything about tech goes, this isn't really going to work, folks. And similarly with the criticism of The Guardian, that's part of this debate about exactly how the press should be regulated, if at all. And the newspapers are pushing back very hard on this and saying, look, we don't think there should be laws about this, because there haven't been any since the 1690s, and we think that's been a good thing.
Really, this book, and it follows well along with the Victorian internet, this book is really about information technology going back to the time of Cicero, to the Roman times.
It is. So the idea of the book is it's just as my Victorian internet book looked at the history of the internet through the lens of the telegraph, this book is saying, actually, social media isn't new either. And it goes back thousands of years, because if you define social media to be the exchange of information with your peers in a sort of horizontal way, peer-to-peer exchange along social networks that creates a distributed discussion or community. That's how I define it. You don't actually need the internet to do that. You don't need a network. You can do it in lots of other ways. So you can do it with what the Romans did. So they exchanged messages on rolls of papyrus. I have one here, in fact. So this
do you
sort of
really?
thing,
oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So this is a piece of papyrus. So it feels like quite stiff paper, and you would unroll it like this, and then it would roll back up again.
Papyrus is a reed that the Egyptians first used to write on.
And they would hammer it together. And so the Romans and the Greeks imported it in vast quantities so that they could write notes on it. And if you were writing a note on this, you could write you could actually stick these together with glue. And so you could make quite a long roll with them. So if you were writing a book or something like that, you might make quite a long, heavy roll of this. But if you were just sending a message to your friend, then you would have to fit it all on one of these. So there was actually this physical limit on how much you could write. So we see the Romans adopting abbreviations, a bit like Twitter users today. So they don't have LOL, but they have things like SPD, which means sends greetings to. So I would say Tom Leo SPD. And then I would also have, there was another one that was a 5-letter abbreviation that essentially meant, I hope you're well, and if you are, that makes me very happy, and by the way, I'm fine. And that was the sort of thing you would write at the beginning of the note, so that you could cut to the chase and say, okay, this is what I really want to talk about. Anyway, so what happens in the Roman period is that you've got quite a high level of literacy, and you've also got the ability to copy and deliver information quite cheaply and quickly. And we can do that because of broadband, and the Romans could do it because of slavery. So they had slaves who would copy stuff for them, scribes, and deliver stuff for them, messengers. And so if you were a wealthy Roman, you might have a staff of slaves who would deliver stuff for you, and they would do the rounds of all your friends within the city of Rome and beyond. And so we see in the letters of Cicero, for example, that he's writing every day, or sometimes more than once a day, to his friend Atticus, and he's writing to lots of other people, and the messages are being sent back and forth by messengers. And so we see this phenomenon of the letters that they're all sending each other, which are filled with political and social gossip, being copied and passed on, and at second and third and fourth hand, like retweets. And the reason the Romans did this was that the Roman political elite was a pretty small group of intermarried families, and so the political gossip and the social gossip were one and the same. If two families fell out, it really could lead to a civil war. And if there was an alliance between two families cemented by a marriage, that would tell you that, the political situation might be changing. So we see the Romans of the period writing to each other. They also, interestingly, have quite a transactional definition of friendship. They have this idea called amicitas, and it's not friends as we think of it today. It's much more like friendship on Facebook. It's sort of people that you wouldn't necessarily want to go and have a drink with, but you kind of feel obliged to to be connected to because it may help you in some way. And so we see this in Cicero's letters, that when he's in a position of power, there are people writing groveling letters to him saying, remember me, I'm your friend. And when he's in a difficult situation, he's writing to people saying, remember me, I'm your friend. So,
Wow.
so there are all of these aspects. I mean, there are many more as well. The distribution of speeches and books, and even the news, the Roman newspaper was all done using papyrus rolls like this being carried around.
Did the Dunbar number hold true in those days as well? The Dunbar number being, well, variously defined as 150. You'd have 150 friends that you could actually know.
That's a really good question, because we have, in Cicero's case, we have his inbox and his outbox, but we don't have this for very many Romans, and we certainly don't have all of it for any of them. So
how is it we have his inbox and outbox?
Well, it's because Romans, when the way he would write a letter, he was actually dictating it to his scribe. So he had a really, if scribes were broadband, he had like a really fast connection. Because he had a very, very good scribe called Tyro, who is accredited by some people with inventing shorthand.
Wow.
And some people say he invented the ampersand symbol. It would have been lovely if he'd invented the @ sign. That would have been just completely fantastic. But unfortunately, not. Anyway, so Tyro, Cicero and other Roman nobles would dictate their letters. And Julius Caesar was said to have been able to dictate 2 letters at once while on horseback. So he would have 2 scribes riding alongside him, and he would say, oh, and then say this, and then say this, and they'd write it down. And then he'd say to someone else, then say this, and then say this. And so anyway, they would be dictating these letters, and then the scribes would read them back to them, and they'd say, oh, change this to that. And so it was like a word processor, but it was speech driven. But it was a scribe doing it, a slave. And then eventually, when they were happy with it, Tyro would make a neat copy of it on one of these, and it would be sent out by messenger. But they would keep the draft, and this meant that if anyone went to Cicero and said, "I hear you wrote a really good letter about this," he could give them a copy. And there are examples of where he says this, where he writes letters that are open letters, because they expected their letters to be copied. And also, on occasion, he would deliberately send out multiple copies. So if he'd made a speech and he thought it was particularly good, he would send out bunches of rolls that were, and other Romans did this too, and they could also publish sort of pamphlets by sending out collections of rolls, and people would read them and then copy them and pass them on. And
Amazing.
So more people might read a speech than hear it being delivered. So this is very much a social media environment that has amazing similarities with what we do today.
No kidding. And of course, they would also use these. These are the prototype iPads. These are these are wax tablets. Here's a Roman couple. She's holding a stylus, and he's holding the papyrus.
So he's got the papyrus like me, and it's got the little kind of bit on it that, if you show that picture bigger, it's got a little label on it, which is like it's like the spine of a book. So it's how you can identify what the name of the book is when it's on a shelf. That little bit there. And she's holding a Samsung Galaxy Note 3, obviously. I'm sorry. So she's a Roman.
It's close.
Yeah, well, exactly. So she's holding one of these little groups of wax tablets that they wrote on as notebooks. And she's got the stylus in her hand there. And these two are actually, he's the baker and she's his wife, and they lived in Pompeii, and which is why the mural in their house has been preserved. They're members of the Roman middle class, and they're saying, look at us, we are literate. His name is Terentius Neo. And so there he is looking at us across nearly 2,000 years of history. And they are the sorts of people who were able to participate in this social media system. I mean, they would probably not have had a large staff of slaves, but they would have been able to read and write. And so they would have been able to read, for example, the newspaper that was published in the Forum each morning in Rome. And the funny thing about the Roman newspaper, it was founded by Julius Caesar, and it was only produced in 1 copy a day. Exactly 1. It had a circulation of 1. Well, it didn't, because they put it up in the Forum on notice boards, and people would go and copy it. So if you then look at the Roman iPad that you've got there, if I'm a Roman noble and I want to read the news over my breakfast, I send my scribe down to the Forum in one of those. Now that thing has exactly the dimensions and aspect ratio of an iPad.
It's 4:3.
It's hilarious. It's 4:3, which tells you that Google might be wrong about this whole 16:9 thing.
That's hysterical.
The Romans have been there and tried that and decided that this was good. And I have to say, I find 16:9 a bit strange. So I'm with the Romans on this one.
This is
but
natural,
anyway, right. So this fits into your hand quite nicely. And your scribe would write down the bits of the news they thought were relevant to you. So they were filtering it for you. And then you would write letters using these bits of papyrus to your friends saying, oh, have you heard, blah, blah, blah. And we see in the letters of Cicero and Pliny the Elder and in Tacitus that when Romans were out of town, they expected their friends to keep them informed by sending them these letters with snippets of news, with their analysis, with their comments on it, and they would then copy them and pass them on to their friends. So the Romans were using their friends the audience was distributing the newspaper for one thing, because there were no printing presses. So, the state would publish this gazette every day and just leave it to the readers to distribute. So that's social distribution right there. But the other thing was that the Romans who were reading it were using their friends, their social networks, to filter and recommend the items of interest to them, which is exactly what we do today. So, Arianna Huffington was sort of 2,000 years late to the party on this one.
This is the most, I've never seen such a beautiful mural.
Isn't it beautiful? So the lovely thing about this mural is it came to London this year. There's a touring exhibition about Pompeii, and it came to London and was in the British Museum. And so I went to it mainly to see this. This is actually a crop of it, which was the only version of it I could get permission to use. There are larger versions of it on the internet that are square. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it speaks to us because these are Romans. They're ordinary Romans. Right. They're not members of the nobility, and they're saying, "Look at us, we are literate." That is the message of this image, and it's very similar to the way we sort of like to. Parade our computer literacy these days. Look, I've made a new website, or I've built this, or I've.
These are selfies.
Yeah, well, it kind of. They didn't paint it themselves, but some people have pointed that out to me. Yeah, but it's like, look at me. That's the.
It's totally.
That's the sort of message
it's your first selfie. Which all of this kind of leads one to think that what is going on in the internet now is just a totally natural human thing that we have done as long as there have been humans.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I would distinguish between social networking and social media, but it's clear that, go back to the Dunbar number, and I cover that whole thing at the beginning of the book. It's clear that the desire to sort of place yourself in a social hierarchy through networking and through exchange of information is fundamentally programmed into the human brain. So there's this whole debate about why the human brain has such a large neocortex, and this is Dunbar's whole theory, that the main function of it is to do social processing. So that's part of it. And then chimpanzees and other primates do that through grooming. So who you groom and who you allow to groom you, and who you let watch while you groom someone, is how you sort of establish and strengthen these social bonds and maintain these coalitions within a large group. And then we humans developed language as a means of grooming at a distance, because it meant that we could maintain social connections with more than one person at a time while doing something else, like hunting or processing grain or whatever. And then what happens with media, as soon as we invent writing about sort of 5,000 years ago, is it becomes possible to exchange gossip with people at a distance. And so you start to have the ability to send messages to people far away. But of course, most people aren't literate. So it's only in the Roman period that we really get social media in the sense of a distributed discussion between peers. Up to that point, you've had a sort of class of scribes who can write, and they're very interested in keeping writing as difficult as possible. So the Egyptian scribes seem to have actually fought off attempts to adopt the alphabet, because the alphabet would have made writing too easy and would have undermined their privileged position. So it's only in Greece and really in Rome that you get more literacy. And the Romans then have this wide territory that they control, that they need to exchange messages across. They have a high degree of literacy, and then they have slaves to carry and copy the messages. So that's when we get the first media system. And then the book goes into all of the subsequent examples throughout history. And yes, essentially, and it's the same joke that I tell in Victorian internet, which is that the technologies come and go. With Victorian internet, I'm looking at the telegraph and the impact it had. And the telegraph operators end up having online romances, flame wars, online weddings. There are sort of, there's code breaking, there's cybercrime, you name it, it happens on the telegraph. And so in both cases, what I'm saying is that the technologies come and go, but they still push the same old buttons in our Stone Age brains, that human nature underneath this is actually, basically constant.
What is the role of graffiti in this?
Well, so another example of Roman social media is that they used to like writing on the walls in their towns. And
that's where the title comes from, obviously.
That's one of the places. It's sort of a multiple thing. But in the same way that those Romans we just saw like to flaunt their literacy, it turns out that Roman nobles would sometimes write on each other's walls in their houses. And we would think that was, if someone came around to my house for dinner and wrote on the wall, I probably wouldn't be terribly impressed. But But for Romans, it was a sort of visitor's book, as far as I can tell. That if I went round to someone, I would write a message saying what a fantastic dinner I'd have, or how I sent them greetings in perpetuity, or whatever. And this would be a way of advertising my literacy to other people who came to visit, and for my host to advertise the sophistication of his friends, and we would all be able to read them. And then we also get examples in shared spaces, either in streets, or actually my favorite example is an apartment block in Rome where you have a staircase that's shared and then a bunch of apartments at the top. And the tenants seem to have had this sort of game going on the stairs where they're all trying to outdo each other with witty poetry. And it looks just like a Facebook comment thread. You know, someone makes a bad joke and then someone makes an even worse joke underneath, and then someone quotes some poetry, and it just goes on and on like that. So these seem to be sort of timeless characteristics of human nature.
It's really amazing. We're talking to Tom Standage. He's a digital editor of The Economist magazine, the editor-in-chief of The Economist.com, and his latest book, The Victorian Internet, is a must-read about the Telegraph. This one is called Writing on the Wall.
On the wall. We're having it changed. I'll get the British cover and show it to you.
Writing on the wall, which makes a lot more sense than writing in the wall.
It does, yeah.
Social media in the first 2,000 years. I want to ask about the first example of viral media in just a second. But first, let's tell you a little bit about Lynda.com, one of our great sponsors. We all have the need to keep up. Things move fast in this technological age. We've got software we need to know how to use, software that gets updated. OS 10 Mavericks comes out and everything's new. How do you keep up? Lynda.com's how I keep up. It's a really great way to learn. Many of Lynda's teachers are people you know from our shows. Scott Bourne teaching photography, Derek Story, Ben Long, and of course the great Bert Monroy teaching Photoshop. They literally get the best teachers on every subject. There are 2,000 plus high-quality online courses and training videos. You have access to them entirely for one low monthly fee. I mean, it's everything from Excel and Photoshop and Dreamweaver and WordPress and QuickBooks and PowerPoint to soft business skills like time management, negotiation. There's Lynda, by the way. Known her for years, one of the greatest people around. I just love her, and this site is really a reflection of what she has accomplished as a great teacher. You can learn programming, too. App and web development, Raspberry Pi. Tom did a little neat Arduino project with his daughter for school. I'll have to talk about that in a little bit. You can learn all that stuff. They just added a Mavericks Essentials course, lighting for video production, management tips, the fundamentals of content marketing. Now, the Romans may have had papyrus, but we've got Lynda.com, a great way to learn, and not just on a computer, also on an iPad, anywhere. In fact, you can switch devices, move from your computer to your tablet, your phone. They have transcriptions of everything. Look at all these courses. Transcriptions of everything. So you can jump to, search the text, jump to that part, and go right to that part of the video. Now, normally it's $25 a month for access to Lynda's entire course library. For $37.50 a month, not only do you get the library, but you get all the exercise files that let you follow along with the instructor as they work on that Photoshop project or that Word project. You can try it right now, though, at our special address for 7 days free. 7 days free. Lynda, Lynda.com/triangulation will give you access to all of it. Lynda.com, Lynda.com/triangulation. I'm putting together a playlist of some of my favorite Lynda courses and from some of my favorite Lynda instructors, some of my best friends. So we'll put that up on the Lynda site soon. Lynda.com, Lynda.com/triangulation. Tom Standage is here. He's the author of a brand new book called Writing on the Wall, Social Media in the First 2,000 Years. And there you go. That's the British one. It's much better. See, it's an O. Why would they change that?
On the US cover, and I don't know why it got changed.
It's the only part they changed.
We're going to change it back.
Publishers are so weird.
What can I say?
I just don't understand them. So you talk about Martin Luther nailing his 99 Theses on the wall as one of the first, maybe even the first viral phenomenon.
Yeah, so Luther writes this list of 95.
95. I gave him 4 extra theses.
Yeah, exactly. So they're theses, and they are reasons that they are subjects he would like to debate. Relating to the Catholic doctrine of indulgences. And this is the idea that if you give the church money or do other things, you or your relatives will get out of purgatory more quickly when you die. And the church is selling indulgences in a big way at this point, which is 1517, to raise money for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And Luther thinks this is all a scam, basically. So he writes this list of 95 things he would like to ask. If this was today, it's basically a listicle. So it would be on BuzzFeed.
95 things that you never knew the Catholic Church was doing wrong.
But if this is a real BuzzFeed listicle, it has to have the word crazy in the title.
Crazy.
Right? So 95 crazy things, 95 crazy questions the Pope must answer about indulgences, something like that. Anyway, so he writes this down, and he writes it in Latin because he's a theologian, and that's the language of the theologians. And he pins it to the door of the church in Wittenberg, which is the university notice board for Wittenberg, where he's a theologian. And he's basically saying, by pinning them up, let's have a debate on these subjects. Who wants to do it? And so people go, wow, this is hot stuff. He's asking some really good questions. Like, if the Pope actually has the power to release people from purgatory, shouldn't he just release them all now? Why ask for money? Why wait? If he's a Christian and he's really interested in... Anyway, so it was just a bizarre situation, and I have a lot of sympathy with Luther's views on this, as you can probably tell. Anyway, so people are going, wow, he's really sticking it to the Pope here. So they start copying it down, not on papyrus, because the paper is available by this stage, and they start passing these paper copies around. So far this is all very Latin, because very Roman, because it's in Latin and it's on paper and it's being copied out. But the thing that's happened since the Roman era is that the printing press has been invented, and so some printers get hold of this and they reprint the theses, and they print like 500 or 1,000 copies, and then they get carried to other towns, and printers there get hold of them. And so what we learn from a contemporary of Luther's is that it takes 2 weeks for this list to get around the whole of Germany. And
that is viral.
Exactly. But 4 weeks for the whole of Western Europe.
Wow.
And Luther is astonished by this. He's not expecting this at all. But he realizes this gives him an opportunity, because evidently the audience is amplifying messages that it is interested in and agrees with. And so if they're interested in these theological Latin statements, and some of them have been translated into German, but most people can't read Latin. In fact, most people can't read at all. But maybe he can use this to his advantage. So he follows up with a series of pamphlets in German, and they're written in a deliberately easy-to-understand German that doesn't rely on any local idiom or dialect. And he gives the text of this pamphlet to a local printer who prints 1,000 copies, and they spread to other towns, and the same thing happens again. And he does this again and again and again, and he realizes from the popularity of his work, he's not getting paid for any of this. It's just spreading, and the printers are making the money here. But people are really interested in what he has to say, and that suggests to Luther that there is widespread support for his views. And of course there is, and the ultimate result of this is the splitting of the church into Protestants and Catholics, and we call this the Reformation. And so it is arguably the first example of social media playing a role in a revolution like that.
He lit a fire, but there were responses too. So the sellers of indulgences said, you're full of it. The Pope's defender wrote a dialogue against the presumptuous theses of Martin Luther, and he called Luther a leper with a brain of brass and a nose of iron, and there was a flame war.
There was totally a flame war, but the interesting thing, so initially the Pope said, we don't have to respond to this guy because
just ignore him. Ignore the troll.
Blogger? Who is this blogger? It's like a CEO today. Well, a CEO 5 years ago, and some blogger writes some rude thing about their company, and you go, well, we don't need to worry about that. No one will pay attention. Of course, it starts to gain traction, and so then the company realizes they have to respond. The same thing happened with the Pope. He said, I don't need to respond to this. I'm the Pope. I'm infallible. For a start, and secondly, he's just some drunk, and when he's sobered up, he'll realize the mistake he's made. And then they realized that actually they needed to do something about this, but the Pope couldn't respond himself because he was infallible. So he, if he admitted that this was something that you could argue about, then that would be admitting that this was, there was a debate to be had about this, and there was no debate to be had because the Pope was infallible. So he got some bishops to respond on his behalf, and they did a pretty rubbish job. That bit you just read out, they essentially insulted Luther and said he must be wrong because the Pope is infallible.
Right.
And Luther said, what kind of an argument is that? What is the basis of it? Show me the scripture that says where this stuff about indulgences is written down in the Bible. It's not there. And so he responded to them, but the other stupid thing they did was that they wrote these rebuttals to him in Latin. as theological rebuttals. And of course, most people couldn't read Latin. The people who could read could mostly read German. And so the rebuttals were much less popular than Luther's original pamphlets, not only because most people didn't agree with them, but also because they were written in a language that people couldn't understand. So they did a really, really bad job of this sort of social media firefighting campaign. And as a result, this was a sort of signal to the rest of Europe, and kings and queens across Europe immediately realized they had to do things like regulate the printing presses if they were going to stop this happening to them. So this is where we get the sort of clampdown on printing and so on. But the other fun thing about Luther is that you can actually plot his traffic stats. So I did this in the book because the important thing for Luther was not how many pamphlets he wrote each year. What was more important was how many
followers.
Right, no, well, it wasn't even that. It's how many retweets, right?
Retweets.
So how many reblogs, plus ones, whatever you want to call it. But the important thing was how many new editions. There you go. He's got this massive spike in traffic in 1523, which is the height of the Reformation.
Look at all the page views.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's Omniture. It's Omniture in or Quantcast in the 16th
Analytics.
century.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the point is that top bit of the graph there, the light grey bit, is the number of retweets of the German pamphlets. So it's the number of new editions that are, the number of reprints that happen each year. And we're talking about millions of pamphlets floating around in Europe over the course of that decade, sort of 5 to 7 million. And these were things that people could afford. Buying a Gutenberg Bible, I mean, that's what everyone talks about from this period. Oh, yes, the printing press showed up and you could buy a Bible. Buying a Bible was like buying an enormous Lexus. Most people couldn't afford to do it. But buying a pamphlet was like buying a chicken. It was much more affordable. It was much smaller. You could hide it if the priest came round. And it was, for many people, the first example of printed material that they ever bought. But the crucial thing here is that this connects to the Arab Spring, because this is what Luther did. Was he realized that the popularity of his writings indicated a hidden view that people weren't expressing openly, but that a very large number of people agreed with, which was that the Catholic Church had become too corrupt. And essentially, this is called synchronization of opinion by modern media scholars. This is also what happens in Tunisia and Egypt, where people are sick of the government and they're not sure how many other people feel the same way. And it's social media that allows them to connect with other people and realize what's going on, which is that there is this groundswell of opposition.
They also made popular songs, parody songs, the equivalent of YouTube videos.
They were sort of mashups, yeah. So they would take
mashups.
They were. So the funniest are the contrafacta, and what they do there is they take a pious tune to a hymn or something like that, and then they apply lyrics that insult the Pope in really graphic terms to it. So it's the contrast. What's funny about it is the contrast between the rude lyrics and the very pious tune. So it's just like with mashups on the internet, and I'm a huge fan of mashups, but the best ones are where you take songs from totally different genres and do something completely unexpected with them. Those are the most amusing. Whereas if you just take two bands that sound a bit like Coldplay and mash them up, that's kind of tedious.
Boring, yeah. The song "Now We Drive Out Winter" was rewritten to say "Now We Drive Out the Pope," and they rewrote the lyrics. I love it.
And they had woodcuts as well. So they had these very graphic images of where these devils sort of defecating and the priests coming out of them, so the point of this part of the Luther social media campaign was that these woodcuts were understandable even if you weren't literate. And
now they're getting right to the masses.
Exactly. So this is people. He had people reading out his pamphlets, to their illiterate friends, but he also had this sort of graphics thing on the side. He had a friend called Louis Cranach, who was a fantastic engraver and who did these just unbelievably pretty pornographic images of how corrupt the priesthood and the bishops and the Pope were. And this was and to be honest, the Catholic Church fought back. It did similar things. It had pictures of Luther saying he was a devil and he was making stirring up a mixture of treason and lies and this sort of thing. So this was a sort of multimedia battle that happened.
And of course, the Pope responded, as all good monarchs do, with the Edict of Worms and tried to shut the whole thing down. In fact, there's a long history of trying to control this kind of social media. As soon as you mentioned, as soon as they realized the power of it, they said, we got to fix this.
Yeah, so what we see in the later 1500s is across Europe, regulations come in about what you're allowed to print. And essentially, most countries go for the same thing. They say you need to have anything you want to print approved in advance, so pre-moderation of comments. And we reserve the right to say no. And you also have to put the name of the printer and the town where he printed it. So if anything improper gets printed, we can go and shut him down. And of course, this didn't work at all. Immediately, people started doing things like writing, that they had the permission to print when they didn't, making up the names of printers who didn't exist, or attributing their works to printers in completely different countries so that they didn't fall foul of this law. So it was very much sort of what happens now, where people use anonymity and pseudonymity as a way of getting into trouble for saying things that the authorities maybe don't want them to say. And then also it reminds us that these distributed, decentralized media systems are extremely hard to control. If you have a revolution in a banana republic, the first thing you do is take over the TV station, because you only have to take over one TV station and you've got all the TV. And you can't do that with printing presses, or indeed with the internet, because you have a decentralized infrastructure, and so you can try and clamp down on illicit printing, but you can never quite get all of it. And so we see all sorts of cat and mouse games between regulators and printers around this time.
This is I tell you, this is a lot of fun. If you like history and you like the internet and you like to think about it, as I often do, I have a kind of a soft spot for this kind of what was in common kind of history, the common threads between social media of today and the social media of 2,000 years ago. Writing on the wall by Tom Standage, who is editor-in-chief of the Economist.com site, which is a great job, I might add. And there's a TEDx speech online of some of these ideas, if you want to.
There is. There's a summary of. I mean, the basic idea is I look at the different social media ecosystems that arose between the Roman period and essentially the French Revolution, early 19th century. And what I'm trying to do is make the point that they have all these similarities. Mm-hmm. And then if you believe that that's the case, that means that there's a lot we can learn from them. It turns out many of the issues that are raised by social media today arose in the past around these previous social media systems. So, is social media a waste of time? Does it trivialize and coarsen public discourse? Does it cause revolutions? All these sorts of things are questions that have arisen before, and that history can actually help us answer today.
Does it boil down to the people in power, the incumbents, we say today, being upset at the rabble? That really, that's the problem, is that it's democratizing, and we have the pulpit, and you can't. It's not your turn.
We see this again and again and again, that whenever a technology makes it easier for more people to publish stuff, the people who previously had access to the technology, the previous elite, say, oh, this won't do. The wrong people will publish the wrong things.
Right.
So in fact, even when Luther's publishing, Erasmus, his contemporary, is a great European intellectual. He says the problem with these pamphlets flying around is that nobody's reading the classics anymore. No one's reading Cicero. They're not reading the great Greek and Roman authors. By his standards, the pamphlets of Luther are trivial, and they're easy to read, and they're short. Who's going to read a whole book of Cicero when they can just read a book, a tiny pamphlet by Luther? So it's the same complaint we see about, kids these days can't concentrate for any more than a tweet's worth of, or whatever. But we see it again when books appear, when the printing press appears and books become much more widespread. There's this sort of fear of information overload, but there's also this fear that the wrong people will use it, and we need to control it. And we see the printers' guilds getting together and saying, give us a monopoly on printing so that we can control what's going on. And so we see this again and again and again and again. And we're seeing it today with Twitter. People saying, well, the problem with Twitter is it allows people to say sexist things, and so we need to do something about it. Twitter needs to fix this, as if this is some sort of technological problem.
Right.
And it's not. It's that when it becomes
it's a
easier
human
to publish,
problem.
Yeah, exactly. You're always going to get some people saying things that that you don't want them to hear, that you don't want to hear. And so the thing is, though, we're kind of getting to the end of this process, because within the next 20 years, I think it's feasible that anyone in the world who wants to publish stuff will be able to do so. So there won't be any more rabble, if you like. There won't be an excluded group of people who don't have access to publishing, whose appearance on the scene will discomfort those who are already able to publish things. So I hope we'll get to the end of this ridiculous process of saying, oh, it's all right for me to publish, but you, oh, no,
Right.
we can't have that. But we see this, with journalists.
We
Journalists
totally see
denigrating
this.
bloggers.
Yeah.
But or do you remember when Amazon switched on user reviews on on its site for books, and all the book reviewers went nuts and said, you can't just have anyone reviewing books. Who are these people?
I'm a licensed reviewer.
Exactly. Yeah, I've been to university. What do they know? And of course, we know that Amazon reviews or reviews on products are incredibly useful.
Yeah.
They are a very, very good thing. So the point is, this coarsening of discourse, this trivialization, one man's coarsening is another man's democratization, and I'm on the side of democratization in this case.
Me too. And we've had this debate. My friend Andrew Keene, who wrote The Cult of the Amateur, how the internet is coarsening our discourse. This is the conversation that goes back and forth.
I have to say, I don't agree. I mean, he's basically trying to protect an elite position there. As you would expect, I'm supposed to be doing this too.
What's wrong with you? You're British. Come on, stop it. Knock it off.
Well, the answer is I've looked at history and I've recognized that, that we need to go back to, the world is going back to this model of a sort of discursive coffee house environment. And that's the way media is going. And we all, in whatever media business we work in, have to find a way to make social and to make sharing our friend. And so that's what I'm trying to do at The Economist, but we're all trying to do that in different parts of the established media industry. But even the idea of a media industry is a very recent phenomenon. It's tied up with the emergence of industrial scale media, which is only something that appears in about 1850.
It's really interesting to see how Luther really wouldn't have gone viral without the printing press. The ability to mass produce copies of his 95 Theses really was what made it viral. If you have to handwrite it, it can go a certain distance, but getting it in the common language, the vernacular, and then printing it in a way that people can get it really makes a big difference.
It does, and we can see that because Luther had two antecedents, people who tried to start the Reformation before him and failed, and it looks pretty convincing to me that this is Wycliffe and Jan Hus, and they both relied on handwritten copies of their screeds, of their views, and this was much harder to scale. And so I think the idea that Luther, succeeded. I mean, part is because he was a brilliant writer. He was just able to sort of, he was able to speak to a very, very large audience, as if he was right there in the room. But having the printing press clearly gave him a massive advantage.
Yeah. Let's talk about coffee houses, because so this is what, 17th century Britain?
Yeah. So first coffee house in England is in Oxford in 1650, and pretty soon they become very popular in London, and you think there are a lot of Starbucks around now. If you look at the number of coffee houses per capita, as far as I can tell, it was actually higher in the 17th century in London.
There were more coffee houses in 17th century London than Starbucks today.
There were an awful lot of them, and it was because they were a respectable place to go and do business. Because if you were a businessman and you could use them as your office, just like we do today, and you would meet people there, and you would, you'd be happy using a coffee house as your office in a way you wouldn't want to use a tavern. And they're of course selling they were selling caffeinated drinks, not alcoholic drinks. And they were also places where you would go to read the latest pamphlets and news books, which were kind of early newspapers, and broadsides, and just anything that was floating around. There were kind of handwritten newsletters that did the rounds at this period as well. So you would go to check up on the news. Coffee houses were also used as mail delivery addresses. So you would say, write to me at the Rainbow Coffee House, because there was no street numbering. So the way you would specify your address was by the sign outside your coffee house. So you would basically go to the coffee house to read the news and check your mail and network with your friends who were in the coffee house.
Exactly what people do.
Exactly. But the thing was that, but the coffee houses had this rule that you were allowed to talk to other people you didn't know, and that they weren't allowed to refuse to talk to you because they thought that you were below them.
Interesting.
So there's this idea that of politeness, this sort of cult of politeness that arises in coffee houses. And so what happens is that we see people and ideas who would not normally have encountered each other mixing in coffee houses. And it becomes this incredibly inviting information environment. And we see this from the diary of Samuel Pepys. He's always writing thence to the coffee house and telling you all the amazing things he heard and read and learnt about in the coffee house. So you could go into a coffee house and not notice the passage of 4 or 5 hours. which sounds quite familiar today.
Yeah.
And in fact, we get the same criticisms of coffee houses that we got of social media. So in the 1670s, we see professors at both Oxford and Cambridge universities despairing at the next generation because they're spending all their time in the coffee houses. They're just networking with their friends and reading newspapers and exchanging trivia, and they don't seem to be doing any work. And this, as far as the professors can tell, is like the end of the British Empire because the next generation of people are hopeless and they're not paying attention. And I don't know about you, but that all sounds quite familiar to me. This is called the ruin of industry.
Yes.
And the coffee houses are the enemies of diligence. But the funny thing is, this turned out to be completely wrong.
It's the opposite, in fact.
Yeah, coffee houses are amazing crucibles of innovation because you have this mixing of people and ideas who otherwise wouldn't have encountered each other. So the Rainbow Coffee House, where the scientists went, turned into the Royal Society and the Scientific Revolution, and Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke and Halley, and they're all going there. And in fact, Newton writes Principia Mathematica, his masterpiece, to settle a coffee house argument between Hooke, Halley, and Wren. And then the coffee house where the stock traders go, which is called Jonathan's, turns into the London Stock Exchange. The coffee house where the marine insurers go, which is called Lloyd's, turns into Lloyd's of London, the first insurance market. So we actually get this incredibly fertile period of scientific and commercial innovation that comes out of the mixing of ideas that takes place in the social platform of the coffee house. So that's why I think, banning Facebook or banning social media at work is a bad idea because we see companies embracing enterprise social media now to encourage collaboration and innovation within and beyond the boundaries of their companies. And I think history tells you that that's the right thing to do. And to say, no, this is not social networking, it's social not working, is a big mistake.
In fact, Neil Stephenson in the Baroque cycle, and particularly in Quicksilver, writes in a beautiful way about the coffee houses and Sir Isaac Newton. It's a wonderful. It really evokes that whole era.
So we're both obsessed with that period, and I know Neil, in fact, and the other person who is also obsessed with this is Stephen Johnson, and all three of us have sort of become enchanted by the sort of modern world in the pre-modern world aspect of the coffee house because it just looks and feels so familiar. And I often think if I had a time machine, what period of history would I go to? Obviously I love the Roman period, but the language would be a bit of a problem. I love the Victorian period, but I think actually if I had to choose, I would choose 1660s, 1670s London, probably after the plague and the fire, because it just sort of looks such an inviting situation. So much was changing so rapidly, and yet it also looks sort of modern in so many ways.
Johnson wrote, "Everything bad is good for you," which I love. How today's popular culture is actually making us smarter. It's the same. Yep. It's the same insight, which is no, this is not. I want to talk about the rise of mass media because I find that fascinating. And of course, in some ways, what we do here is a response to mass media, and kind of the successor, I think, to mass media. So let's talk about that in just a bit. Our guest, Tom Standage, is editor-in-chief of TheEconomist.com. He's also a digital editor at The Economist, and his new book is called Writing on the Wall. But I want to read them all. Now, I read the Victorian internet, but The History of the World in Six Glasses sounds very interesting. That's
my best-selling book, that one. It's basically history told through drinks, and it's on the AP World History syllabus, but yeah,
I like that.
Basically it's a bunch of drinks, and I spun with some serious history. So check that one out.
And the edible history of humanity, I guess, the same idea.
Yeah, same idea, which is the history of the world through food. But from a tech point of view, I'm treating both drinks and food as technologies. Really what interests me is the social impact of technology and the diffusion of technology, and this idea that the technologies come and go, but the human nature is basically unchanged.
Right.
And so what I'm doing with all of these books is I'm looking at these stories about the impact that new technologies, whether it's coffee or beer or writing or social media, had in different periods.
Really, I love this kind of stuff. How do historians react? Because you're a journalist.
Yeah.
Do they have the same thing? Well, you shouldn't be practicing history without a license.
Yeah. I never call myself a historian, so that's the first thing. I don't claim to be a historian. Mm. And journalists have the creed actually of a previous editor of The Economist who said simplify then exaggerate. And that's what you do. So So I find, I mean, I do talk to academic historians, and what I try to do, and we do this at The Economist generally. I mean, I started on The Economist as a science journalist, and what we try to do is write something that, on the one hand, is not offensive to people who actually know what's going on. If you're describing, a particle physics experiment or something complicated like that, but is also understandable to a general reader. So it's connecting those two audiences and writing something that, wherever you fall on the spectrum between them, you aren't offended by what we're doing. And very often that involves finding the right analogy and talking to the scientists and saying, is this the right analogy for what you're doing? Is that the right analogy? How about we put it like this? And so it's essentially the same with what I'm doing here. I talk to historians and make sure that what I'm doing isn't grossly offensive to them, and that it's essentially, I'm not making all of this stuff up. I mean, what I tend to do is put a frame around existing ideas and theories. So the idea that English Civil War pamphlets are a bit like blogs is an idea that has been being kicked around in academia, but academics tend to feel a bit embarrassed by saying this. They'll do a detailed study of pamphlets, and then maybe in the intro or in the last line they'll sort of say, and in this day when publishing has once again become easy, perhaps there are some lessons, but they daren't go. Academics are terribly wary of over sort of generalizing from the evidence, whereas that's what journalists do for a living. So essentially, what I end up in a situation with, what's happened with my books previously, is that the specialists in each of the fields that I've written about have ended up regarding me as sort of an ambassador to the general public, who's not getting it too wrong, and is sort of making what they're doing understandable and accessible. So that's really the outcome I'm striving for.
Perfect. And it's why I'm a journalist, not a historian. I studied history, and love history, but I far prefer the broad. Yeah, well, all right. I just far prefer the broad generalization to the precise fact.
Well, there you go. That's right.
We'll have more with Tom in just a bit. I want to talk about mass media because it's this is my favorite topic. But first, let's tell you a little bit about personal capital. Using information technology to understand your financial life is nothing new. I mean, going back to the days when I hand entered my stuff into Quicken. But we've taken some great strides. Now with Personal Capital, you can literally combine all your financial accounts into a single dashboard that tells you exactly how you're doing. And of course, now more than ever, you need it. How many accounts do you have? Checking, savings, retirement. You've got credit cards, you've got investments, you've got mortgages, you've got loans. If you can see them all in one place and make sense of them, that's when you can decide what to do. Otherwise, you're working in the dark, and this is what computers are so good at. Personal Capital is fabulous at it. You see, you can do it on your desktop. They have mobile apps, too. Combines all your financial information, gives you charts, graphs, reports. They call it a financial GPS. And then, of course, you can make intelligent investments. You can do something smart with your money. And best of all, this is really smart. It's free. It's free. So what I want you to do right now, go to personalcapital.com/triangulation. I did this about a year ago. We actually had the founder of Personal Capital on Triangulation, and we talked all about the finance and money and how it is changing in the world of technology. And I signed up immediately, and I'm glad I did. I've had great value from Personal Capital. That's why we are telling you about it right now. Personalcapital.com. You want to go to personalcapital.com/triangulation to sign up for free so that we get credit. And, if you want to know more, go back to the interview we did with Bill Harris. He was the CEO at PayPal and Intuit. And I think he learned at those places, this could be really useful, and created Personal Capital. He was really a great interview. Personalcapital.com/triangulation. Our guest today, Tom Standage. We're talking a little bit about social media in the last 2,000 years. And the more things change, the more they remain the same, as they say. Let's talk about mass media, because I always I remind people that while it feels like mass media has always been with us, television, radio, newspapers, movies, even books, I guess, that it's a relatively new phenomenon, something that we're not kind of that well suited to do.
Exactly. So we like to talk about old media and new media. And old media is sort of pre-2000, and it's newspapers, radio, and TV, and it's analog, and it's broadcast.
And that's the key. It's broadcast. It's one person, many listeners.
Exactly. Whereas new media, post-2000, we have the internet, and it's digital, and it's social, and it's more likely to be many-to-many or peer-to-peer. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of traditional view. But my point is that old media is not that old. You only get that one-way broadcast environment starting in the late 19th century. And you really get it in the 20th century with radio and TV. Mm-hmm. And so if you look back before that period, to the period I'm writing about, where you've got all these social environments, it looks very much like today. So we have this period that I call really old media.
Papyrus.
Yeah, exactly. So starting with the papyrus and going on from there. But this is really old media. And then you would have radio and TV would be old media and newspapers. And then you would have the internet being new media again. But my point is that there are a lot of similarities between the really old and the new that we can learn from. So what happens in the middle is that having had all of these social distribution systems with papyrus or printing presses or whatever, there's a bunch of others as well. In the early 1800s, the steam press is invented, and this is a steam engine connected to a printing press. And so newspapers up to that point, so I've got a newspaper here from Philadelphia from the 1820s, and so this the sort of thing would have had sort of a circulation of maybe 500 or 1,000.
Really?
And it would have been very, very local. And if you look at what's in it, it doesn't look anything like a modern newspaper. The front page is ads, which is slightly weird, but the main thing
all ads? There's no content on the front page at all?
I don't think so. No, it's all looking like ads to me.
Huh.
And that was a relatively recent invention on here. But actually, no, maybe I'm wrong. No, it's not all ads. There are some at the bottom. But the point is that a lot of this is, nearly all of it is letters from people writing in,
right.
Missing a young lad named Harvey Richards. So then,
I hope they found Harvey.
There you go. All persons indebted to the state of John. So this sort of public announcements, bookkeeping. I wished through the Media Report Journal to call the attention of the public that we. Oh yeah, this is an advertisement from a bookkeeper.
In the sense, it's a journal of the goings on.
It is a social platform because the stuff in there is letters from the readers. And so, Ben Franklin gets his start writing as the widow do-good. He makes up this persona because his brother won't publish his stuff in the paper.
It's said that Ben Franklin invented the U.S. Postal Service so he could get a jump on other newspapers in Philadelphia.
So he gets to that later. So, but the letters that he writes, which are published in his brother's newspaper, and his brother goes, "Wow, this is great." That's typically taken as an example of Franklin's, ingenuity,
wiliness,
which it is, wiliness. But what it also shows you is that if you wrote something interesting enough, people would publish it in the newspaper,
right?
Because these are very, very small local things. Anyway, what Franklin does is he makes postal delivery much more efficient, and he makes it free for newspapers so that they can send copies to other papers. So you end up with this network of papers, and they're all taking stuff from local letters, from speeches, and from other newspapers.
Wow.
So they're reblogging stuff from other papers, which means that if you write something interesting and it appears in a Philadelphia paper, it will quickly spread into all of the other papers.
And much like Tumblr, there's very little original content in any given Tumblr. It's all from somebody else. It's reblogging.
Exactly. It's reblogging. But what that means is that Tom Paine, for example, can write Common Sense, and it can ripple throughout the whole of this American colony's social platform very, very quickly.
So there is a relationship between newspapers and pamphleteering.
Yes. Well, at the time, there's actually they're very closely related. So the newspapers and the pamphlets, you very often see excerpts of pamphlets appearing in newspapers. And you might see a particularly good series of letters to a newspaper, then reprinted as a pamphlet. So to start with, newspapers are very local and very social. But then the steam press shows up, and you can suddenly start to print not 100 or 500 copies a day. You can print 10,000 or 20,000. And so we start with the New York Sun in the 1830s, circulations going up into the tens of thousands. They get up to 1 million by the end of the 19th century. And we also see that these newspapers become mainly reliant on advertising. It's the advertising-funded model because they sell the paper cheap to get a big audience that they can then sell to advertisers. And then the other thing they do is they hire journalists to go out and write crime stories and stuff like that people are interested in and will buy. And so we get this emergence of a class of journalists. And then with radio and TV in the 20th century, we get the same thing. These things are very expensive, but they're very, very efficient for reaching a large audience, but they're one way. So you get a small group of people that can send one-way messages very efficiently to a large audience. And
they require a lot of capitalization. So the only people who really get to control these forms of mass media are the very wealthy.
Indeed, if you look at the setting up of the New York Sun, it's done on a shoestring. It's done for a few $100s, and then the New York Times is set up for something like $1,000 in the 1850s. By the 1870s or 1880s, to compete with these big companies that hundreds of steam presses, you need $1 million to set up a newspaper or something. I mean, it's become a lot more expensive. So the barrier to entry is much, much higher. And with radio, you have not only the expense of building the transmitters, but you also have the fact that there's a limited amount of bandwidth. So there's a limit to the number you can have for that reason as well. And so we get this centralization of media, and it becomes one way and top down. And there's a bottleneck that you have to squeeze you have to get through in order to reach the audience. You have to convince somebody high up that what you have to say is important. And so that's really a new phenomenon. And so the internet has blown all that up, and we've seen the impact that this has had on traditional media companies' models, but no one owes them a living, and those models really only emerged as a short-term result of the scarcity and expense of those broadcast technologies.
And in fact, it could be used for demagoguery. People like William Randolph Hearst with yellow journalism. Hitler himself used radio.
So Hitler is probably the point that's the furthest, the most opposite of social media, because Hitler's radio, the Volksempfänger, the Volkswagen is the people's car, the Volksempfänger is the people's receiver, and it was a radio receiver subsidized by the government, and it could only pick up domestic broadcasts. So all you could do was listen to the Führer banging on, and so it really was one man's vision imposed upon an entire nation. And broadcasting was an amazingly effective way of doing that. So it really was one to many. And of course, then he tries to impose his vision on the whole of Europe. So this is as far away from the peer-to-peer exchanges of the social systems that had come before as it's possible to be. But the great thing about the internet, of course, is that it does allow you to reach a large audience, or at least a potentially large audience, at little or no cost. And so the scarcity, that was associated with printing presses and radio transmitters and TV towers and all the rest of it has gone away. And so we've got this. What happened in the mass media era was people were still writing letters to each other and exchanging stuff socially, but that was completely overshadowed by the power of mass media, of broadcast media. It was just so much more efficient that people's media diet shifted so that more of what they got came broadcast. And now we see people shifting back, and we see young people who don't watch TV or read newspapers at all. They're getting their diet of information filtered through social channels. And Pew just put out a research study this week where they said young people say, I don't read the news or follow the news because if something really important's happening, it will come to me. It will appear in my social streams, and they're right. That's how people get news today, and that's exactly how the Romans did it 2,000 years ago.
It's really exciting. To me, it democratizes it. As somebody who worked in old media for 30 years and was really forced to wend my way through this top-down system and find a chance to speak. And you only do it with the permission of the plutocrats who own the transmitter towers or the printing presses. It's really exciting and liberating to say, hey, I can do it myself, and I can reach, in fact, a broader audience, anybody who's on the internet.
Indeed, but what we're actually seeing now, of course, is a hybridization between social and mass media models. So the way Lady Gaga uses Twitter is basically broadcast. She is not really trans. The way Barack Obama uses Twitter is broadcast. So we see broadcast uses of social platforms, but we also see social uses of the use of social media by mass media platforms. So the mass media firms that survive will be the ones that find a way to make social work for them. So we see, newspapers and TV stations and everybody else trying to sort of integrate social into what they're doing. There are some moderately plausible ways in which that is a good thing. But ultimately, I think the share of sort of headspace that the mass media guys are going to have in the future is going to be smaller than it was, and more of our media diets are going to be things that are filtered through social mechanisms.
There are problems that arise. You no longer have this kind of common experience where everybody watched the Beatles on Ed Sullivan or Elvis on Ed Sullivan and the next morning comes into work to talk about it. But as you pointed out, that's really only a recent event anyway. We're going much more back to our roots of information. Is that all good, or is there some loss there too?
Well, there is. The interesting thing is that this common, the water cooler stuff, it's the same actually as the rise of nationalism. So what you get when you have these big broadcast platforms that have a certain reach, it coincides. Well, it's not a coincidence with the rise of the nation state.
Interesting.
And the sort of most extreme version of that sort of nationalism is Nazi Germany, which makes arguably the most effective use of radio broadcasting. So the binding together of a group of people has positive and negative aspects to it. And of course we see with the people are now talking about the nation states being sort of superseded, that people are more loyal to a company or to a brand or to a band or to a city than they are to a country. And some people are saying we shouldn't be looking at the economies of different countries, we should be looking at the economies of the biggest cities. And so there is this sort of question about whether the nation state has had its day. But at the same time, we sort of have these water cooler moments. I mean, they're not things like memes, the woman who filmed herself dancing around the studio as she resigned. Exactly, quitting her job. And that goes viral. I mean, that's a great example of how you can reach a large audience without having to, convince a newspaper editor that what you have to say is important. Right. But it's also something that, most people are familiar with, and you get the internet tropes and memes. And maybe my mum hasn't heard of some of them, but even Gangnam Style makes it through to my mum eventually.
Yes.
And that's because those things start on social and then they're amplified by the mass media as well. But I think we sort of do have our water cooler moments around around silly internet memes. It's just that we have them in maybe sort of rather than in national groups, we have them in sort of internet tribes, which are not necessarily geographically distinct.
It's distributed.
Yeah.
Are these hybrids, these mass media, social media hybrids, doomed? Is it just a transitional fad or a phase? I don't know. Very often in tech, we say there are two things, A and B, right? And, we love
here's
that,
the old
don't
one,
we?
here's the new one. Yeah, we love this stuff as journalists, right? And you know how it works. We always argue whether B will completely destroy A. And what usually happens is it doesn't. And there's, will network attached storage destroy SANs? Will you name it? We've had this. Will tablets kill the PC?
Right.
Will PCs kill the mainframe? Mainframes are still here. So it's a nice kind of framing mechanism for journalists. But usually what happens is that the old thing doesn't quite go away and learns to coexist with the new things and finds its place. And then when you have these A versus B fights, very often the answer is C. And the debate is rendered irrelevant by the emergence of something else. So, Mac versus Windows, who cares about that anymore? Because mobile just showed up and made that whole debate irrelevant. And so I think we have to avoid falling into these traps of, I'm talking about really there being a different balance between broadcast and social over the course of history. The balance, again, now the pendulum swinging back towards social. We're still going to want broadcast for things like sport events, live broadcasts of breaking news and of reality shows, that kind of stuff. There are things that are defensible for broadcast that where it's retreating to, and you can see it happening. There are other things where that model doesn't really make sense anymore. So I don't think it's everything becomes social and we don't need newspapers anymore, we just listen to our friends. We're still going to have some newspapers, we're just going to have fewer of them. And we're still going to have, some of these, we're still going to have TV channels, but we're going to have, we're probably going to have more of them and smaller, actually, is the way that bit's going to work. But the idea that, the new thing always just totally kills the old thing is wrong.
I love this book, and I love talking to you. Tom Standage is the author of Writing on the Wall, brand new, just came out, Social Media, the First 2,000 Years. It's on Amazon for $9.89, the Kindle price. The hardcover price, I'm not sure, because they've crossed it all off. But you can also go to Amazon, I'm glad to say, You've got the great Simon Vance, who's one of their best narrators, reading this. So many of our listeners are also Audible listeners, and the Audible version is available as well. And of course, I'm sure there's a bookstore somewhere in the 100 miles of you, and you could probably get a copy there too. Tom,
well, this is another of those examples of, the ebook must kill the book. Actually, they're going to coexist, and there are still going to be some things you want a hardback book for. No one wants an ebook for Christmas, or maybe they do. But I mean, it's if you're giving someone a book, if you're giving someone a cookbook, you want to give them a real book. Yeah. So there are parts of this that will survive. Anyway.
Yeah. Not my local bookstore, perhaps, but other parts. Tom, great to talk to you. Really interesting stuff. This is the kind of history I love, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for the other books too. And while I haven't read the History of the World in 6 Glasses, but I'm going to get it. I can't wait to read it.
Please do. Thank you very much indeed.
Tom Standage. He is the digital editor at The Economist, editor-in-chief at economist.com, and the author of Writing on the Wall, brand new, here in the U.S. from Bloomsbury. Although, if you're in Britain, you'll have a much better cover. So get that one. We do Triangulation every Wednesday afternoon, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern time. That's 20... I got to change it now because we're going to go into our summer. We're losing summertime. So it's -8. So that's 24. It's right at midnight, 2400 UTC on twit.tv. Love it if you tune in live because the comments in the chat room are a huge benefit to me. I'd like to see the feedback, but I'd also like to get your questions. If you can't watch live, though, as always, on-demand audio and video available after the fact. twit.tv/TRI, or wherever you subscribe to internet shows, you can always download it there. In fact, if you subscribe, you'll get it every week, and you won't miss an episode. And I guarantee you, I know who's coming up, and we've got some great shows ahead, so you don't want to miss them. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Triangulation. Bye-bye.